Coming up in the shocking stat, further evidence of the demise of the mainstream media, featuring a media outlet whose head is so far up the rear end of the political establishment, they're blind. That's coming up in a few minutes. But first, the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau's economic update this week. Two aspects I want to bring to your attention. As you know, the projected federal deficit continues to rise. Now, obviously, significantly higher than the $25 billion in deficit spending over 5 years promised in the election campaign. It's now morphed into $29 billion this year alone, $132 billion over 5 years, with no mention of that old campaign promise to balance the budget in 5 years. I don't think you had to be the sharpest tool in the shed to see that one coming. But is this the sharp increase in deficit spending? Is this a bad thing? Well, certainly not. I don't think for middle-aged Canadians and seniors, they're not going to be the ones paying it back. But beyond that, the answer depends on what and how the money's spent. A simple common sense approach that seems to escape so many advocates of ever more government spending. The latest rationale for more government spending, of course, is summed up in the all-purpose word infrastructure. Newsflash. The lion's share of the increase in deficits has absolutely nothing to do with infrastructure spending, even when you use the broadest definition, including things like social infrastructure, whatever that is, and green projects. And just so you know, the government's approved 860 of these infrastructure projects, but only one started. But here's the big item to note in the economic update. Despite all the extra spending and deficits, the government's own number projects virtually no change in economic growth. For the next 5 years, the Finance Department projects just under 2% growth. The lesson, and I bet we won't learn this one, there is no magic wand that a government, no matter what political stripe, can wave, creating economic growth. There never has been, but somehow we're all willing to buy into that fiction every time there's an election campaign. That's why during last year's election campaign, I regularly pointed out the self-serving nonsense that governments can control or manage the economy. I use the word self-serving because the fiction reinforces the need for bigger government, more spending, more bureaucratic power, and a rationale for bigger bureaucracies. As I repeatedly say in this show, government has a role to play, but it cannot manage the economy. Lots of examples of failure. I mean, you can't go further than the former Soviet Union, or look at the tragic mess going on right now in socialist Venezuela. Now, there are things that governments can do. Governments can create a court system, for example, that defends private property rights, although we don't want to do it on native reserves, and look at the results there. We can have a school system that prepares students, not just for the next environmental protests, but for employment in an ever-changing environment. And we are years behind on that one, by the way. Our failure to educate our students in economics and finance is what lays the groundwork for idiotic economic policies proposed by the likes of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Both in their own way say that government can create jobs by reducing competition, restricting trade. In Sanders and Hillary Clinton's case, they want to increase taxes. Come on, you got to be an outright idiot to suggest that raising taxes is the path to increased economic growth. But they get away with it because the public isn't versed in the fundamentals of economics. As I've also stated, I am not against borrowing for infrastructure that leads directly to enhanced economic growth and higher incomes. But it's not going to rescue the economy. And the government's own forecasts just confirm that. Let me explain one more time by way of a question how ludicrous it is to constantly suggest that governments can control the economy. Think about yourself. How many variables involved in your decisions to purchase something? I mean, you might consider the store's location. Is the item on sale? What's the quality? What's the perceived value? The point is that there's a ton of variables involved when you purchase something of significance. So you can imagine how many variables are involved in anticipating the collective decisions of 36 million Canadians, or the potential decisions of foreigners considering buying our exports, or others considering making an investment. Simply put, governments cannot control all those variables. If they could, do you really think we'd be stuck at 1% growth right now in Canada? Or Europe's economy would be flatlining for 8 years? And the U.S. would have 94,609,000 permanently unemployed people, not counted in their employment rolls. It's time the public, the media, politicians got over that nonsense and became more realistic in their approach. When they fail, and they will inevitably fail with the high expectations they foster, it's going to add to the public's growing cynicism. The big picture, according to Mr. Murnau's economic update, is that despite record spending, a huge jump in deficits, record low interest rates, a hugely discounted loonie, mediocre is the best we can hope for, which means more entitlement problems down the road. I think it's time for a rethink of how we approach these kind of issues like economic growth. But I'll tell you, there is absolutely no sign of that happening.